Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am really happy to be back with you tonight for the second session of this book talk series. I was sorry to miss last week, though I was at the White House, so I was pretty happy to be there too. Please say hello in the chat box. We'd love to know who's with us. Make sure to chat to everyone so we can all see your comments. Also, don't forget to add your comments and questions there throughout our conversation tonight so you can participate in the discussion. We are so glad that we're able to continue gathering together from all around the world. This has been such a meaningful venue for learning and conversation for so many of us. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for joining us and partnering with us in that task. The book talks are just one small piece of JWA's work. I invite you to check out jwa.org to explore the full range of our programs and resources. I think you will find it interesting and quite a rabbit hole to go down. One very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the CC button on the bottom where it says show captions, and that should work for you. And let us know in the chat if you're having any trouble with any of that. I am so happy to welcome our author for this evening. Cindy Kaplan is joining us. She has a master's degree in psychology and currently practices as a conscious parenting coach and soul care coach, serving parents, families, and individuals nationwide. She's the author of the book Freefall, One Mother's Journey Raising a Child with Special Needs, which we'll be talking about tonight. She's also published and contributed to many print and online parenting publications. She was recently featured as one of the global experts included in Dr. Shefali Tsabari's Parenting Summit. She's the co-founder of Evolving Together, an online community for parents and caregivers of neurodivergent kids, and she's a mother of 3. She lives in Newton, Mass, which is also where I am, with her family and 2 dogs. Welcome, Cindy. So glad to have you here with us tonight.
It's great to see you, and I'm so glad to be here.
This is so fun. This is one of those. Often I'm talking to people who are all over the place. This is one of those times where I'm like, it's really nice to be online so that people can be joining us from all over the world, but it is kind of silly that we're sitting in the same city and we're in our little respective boxes. And I look forward to when we can get together in person.
Absolutely. I was thinking we could have just met at one of our houses and sat at the same table together.
I know. Somehow anyway, that doesn't work quite as well for these things, but anyway, we'll make it feel like we're in the same room. So why don't we get started with, maybe we'll start with you reading an excerpt just to bring us into your story, and we'll have the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, I will do that. And I think before I even read the little intro that I'm going to read, I'll just preface this by saying a little bit about my daughter, Mira, because I think it just helps put it in perspective. So the book is primarily about me raising my daughter, Mira, who is about to turn 22 in October. She has, just because you wouldn't get this from the reading I'm about to do, so she has cerebral palsy, and she uses a variety of methods for communication, none of them really fluently, but she expresses herself in a number of ways, but without being able to verbally speak words. And she gets around by a manual power chair and a manual chair and a power chair. And she requires assistance for all daily living tasks, but she is probably the most grounded, happy person I know.
She definitely exudes joy.
That she does. So that being said, this is from chapter 1 titled Mira Enters the World. She needs a haircut, says Noah, our 3-year-old. We brought him to the neonatal intensive care unit to see our newborn daughter. There was a sink for hand washing immediately upon entry to the NICU. I washed my hands first, and then Noah, without any fuss, washed his own. I reached for his hand, and we walked down the long hallway, passing nurses in blue scrubs and babies in incubators, behind glass windows where only medical experts were allowed. With each step closer to Mira, I imagined what it would be like for Noah to experience being a big brother. I felt my gut and throat tighten. What would he think of all the tubes, wires, and monitors? Would he be scared? His yellow pant legs swooshed as we proceeded wordlessly down that hallway to meet his newborn sister. Even on his tiptoes, Noah was too little to see the babies behind the glass, but he certainly heard the beeps and dings from the various monitors. Mark, my husband, was waiting for us by Mira's crib. He lifted Noah up to see Mira lying on her tiny hospital mattress. I watched my son take her in. As he vocalized her need for a haircut, my heart softened, my eyes smiled, and I glanced over at Mark. It was true that Mira had come into this world with lots of hair, streaked with the kind of blonde and brown highlights many women pay to have done at salons. In the midst of circumstances that otherwise lacked any sense of normalcy, Noah's observation was wonderfully normal. What I didn't know at the time was that normal is a construct, a projection of what we have been taught to expect when a child enters our lives. There were tubes and wires all over Mira's body, a tiny tube in her nose and a thicker one taped to her mouth, colored wires that led from sparkling silver stickers on her chest to monitors overhead, and more wires that decorated the top of her full head of hair. There were always one or two nurses standing by her clear plastic crib, glancing up at the monitors and adjusting the dials and buttons on the side. Less than 10 feet away on either side of Mira's crib were other babies in incubators and cribs with monitors like Mira's that lit up with neon lines and made beeping sounds that came with no predictability. A couple of years later, when I brought Mira to Noah's kindergarten class, one of the children noticed that one of Mira's eyes was focused inward and asked Noah, "Does your sister have crossed eyes?" "No, she just has special needs," Noah explained in his usual accepting, matter-of-fact way. To him, his sister was a person like any other. When we told Noah that we had decided, at the recommendation of her ophthalmologist, to get Mira corrective surgery that would prevent her eye from turning inward, he said, "Why? That's just a part of Mira. That's who she is." At 5, Noah couldn't understand the greater reasons for the surgery, but he was connected to a deeper truth I still had to learn. The beautiful thing about Noah was how naturally he accepted his sister from the start. It took a long time for me to measure up to my son's acceptance of Mira. I was learning how hard it can be for parents to accept who their child is, whether it's a physical issue that stems from birth, or a child's inclination, temperament, or even interest that is different from one's own.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's really beautiful. And I think so relatable to so many people about both the ways that kids can just accept things that adults have. We've like unlearned the ability to see things as they are. And we bring so many expectations and anxieties that cloud our vision, and just the hard work of realizing that we have to unlearn so much of that.
Yeah, no, and that is such an important point, because that is exactly it. That children, I have found children under the age of 6, that we don't come into the world with judgment, right? Even up to the age of 3, we as human beings aren't judgmental of others. And so it was always fascinating to see how young children responded to Mira. And then around the age of 5 or 6, they would start hiding behind their parents or just begin to question. And so it's around that time that these layers upon layers of judgments and expectations are placed on us. And that doesn't leave us. And then as we enter adulthood and become parents ourselves, we're loaded in a very unconscious way of expectations of these little people who come into our world.
Mm-hmm. And you articulate so beautifully, right, in that first section, that one of the, I think, themes throughout your whole book of just sort of like reconceiving the whole idea of normal and what that means and why that's even a concept that we hold so tightly to. Tell us a little bit about how that evolved for you.
Yeah, right. So this idea of normal as the ideal, right? I mean, there is a normal, right? There is a normal in that it is Actually, I heard somebody recently, it might have been Dr. Gabor Mate, talk about like normal it's a temperature, right? As we take our kids' temperature, there's normal and there's above normal and there's below normal and there's normal. That's normal. Any normal outside of that has somehow been manufactured as the ideal. And so, sorry, going back to your original question was how I sort of understood that or reckoned with that.
Yeah, and sort of how did your relationship to the idea of normal change over time?
Yes. Okay. So when Mira was first born, I really struggled. I think I struggled with just understanding where to place her, right? In my head, in my fantasy, right? This was anything but the fantasy that I imagined, where for years, and certainly the 9 months that I was pregnant with her, what my child was going to look like, be like, what it was going to be like to have 2 children, what a family of 4 was going to look like. And, the title of the book is Freefall, because I really felt like I was pushed off a cliff with nowhere to land. I didn't know where to put my, put my feet. And so for years, and even now when I'm working with other families, there is always this comparison. What is normal? Because if our child isn't in the world of normal, then either 2 things happen. One, we feel and sometimes put upon them that they aren't enough, right? If they're not normal, then something's wrong with them. And if they're not normal, then something's wrong with us, that we are failing as parents. And it's our job to bring them up to normal. So like big picture, culturally, I think one of our biggest challenges is that we have idealized the typical and idealized normal. And I think after, my experience and learning and growing along with Mira is that if I held her to this standard of wanting her to be normal, I would be missing out. I mean, you said she radiates joy. And so if I hold the standard of normal, I would miss out on everything that she has to offer. And what she has to offer is so beautiful because it isn't within the realm of normal. And normal, I think for most of us, is what we expect on the outside. Mm-hmm. And so if we take these expectations of what our kids should be doing, even the normal of going to preschool and then elementary school and then high school and then college and then getting married and having children, we really can lose sight of who our children are. And so I think this idea of normal is actually quite debilitating.
Right. It feels like it becomes some distraction that, as you're describing it, I'm thinking of it as sort of like this, scrim that's kind of blocking out all the complexity and beauty that all people are, which is messy, which is super messy. And I think that's part of, that was part of what really struck me too. And that was something I really related to in your book, is that sense of like what it is to be a person who likes to be in control, who copes with things that are hard by figuring out the plan, mm-hmm. and then executing the plan, right? And you write about like sort of being like off the map, right? Like being used to having a map and wanting a map and being like, okay, here's what we're going to do. And then sort of recognizing like, okay, we're in uncharted territory here. And maybe map isn't even the metaphor we should be striving for, because it might not be achievable, or that might again bring us back to that sense that there's like a right way to go and a wrong way to go, or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. And I think this metaphor of the free fall, when I first, this being pushed off the cliff was very unsettling, right? And I am a person who likes to have control or know what is happening. And so I sort of felt like I was constantly striving for, the reach of a branch, and I would get a hold of this branch. And I did this with Mira. It was like, okay, we're going to try this therapy and this is going to be it. Or I would move my goals like, okay, she's going to sit at the age of 3, she's going to sit. And then when she didn't sit at 3, then I was falling again. Right. Mm-hmm. And I realized that what was so painful was actually trying to grab hold of these branches in the first place. And so as I continued to sort of fall, that the comfort I found had nothing to do with the stuff on the inside, and that the comfort was actually found within. And what I originally started with was this connection I felt to Mira before she came home in those 4 weeks in the intensive care unit, that, when I was away from her, I would be floundering and I would be fearful. And I had even weird visions of like, who is this creature? And then I was with her. And there was this unbelievable, indescribable sense of this soul to soul connection. And so that is what I strive for. Like, that is what I've continued despite everything that we still have to do. Yes, she needs therapy and she is in school, and, you know, there's many things that one has to do, but within that, I think she has also taught me that what I strive for with my other children too is, in all my relationships, is that there's nothing more important than this connection. And that connection exists not necessarily in the world of normal, and exists when we stop reaching for the securities outside of ourselves.
Yeah, you write a lot about sort of having to get away from this idea of your job being to fix anything, whether it's to fix Mira or to fix any particular situation, and how hard that was. And even reading it, I was thinking like, yeah, there's a moment even in reading it of just being like, well, but you have to do the things that will help or whatever. But then you realize even just the framework of envisioning it as fixing means that there's something broken, and that's a judgment around, you know, yourself and Mira and just any aspect of the situation that is not a helpful framework.
Yes. Yes. And I think where it's most harmful actually is that if, and I think I did this to some degree too, in my efforts to, and it comes from such a good place, right? I think it comes from such a good place that I would say so many of us as parents are fixers, right? Our kids are fighting. We want to fix it. We want to step in. How else are they going to learn if we don't step in and fix it? But it has so much to do with our own discomfort in sitting in that place of this uncomfortable place. And so when I was bringing Mira literally like all over the country and within the state to all these different therapies, because I wanted to give her the best life possible. And then at some point I was like, oh my gosh, I'm spending so many hours driving her and bringing her to all these therapies. What does she think of that? And really, finding a place of my own, like really being honest with myself and saying, oh my gosh, I'm trying to fix her. I'm trying to fix what's actually not broken. And the harmful part is that when we're in that mindset, that our kids feel everything. And so that's when I really had to adjust that, because I thought, wow, the last thing I want is for Mira to then feel like she's broken. And there's no way that we can operate in a world of trying to fix our children or their situations without them feeling like then there's something to be fixed.
Right. The not enoughness that you referenced before. Yes. And I thought it was so interesting also the relationship that you explore about, the relationship between the ways in which we might worry that our kids are not enough and our own sense as parents, and particularly often as mothers, of being not enough. Can you say a little bit about that? There's so much there's so much in that.
Yeah, well, like it's generation to generation to generation to generation. Okay. I always think my situation was really interesting because so my mother definitely, she was an amazing mother in so many ways. And I feel very blessed because I feel like one thing that I got from her as a child was this notion that I was enough, that my sister and I were very different. And I was enough exactly as I was. And I got that message, and I'm so grateful for that message. However, she lived a life where she didn't feel enough and did not get that message from her own mother. So while she was able to pass that on to me in her words, and I felt it, but what she modeled was not enoughness. And so of course that still settles, somewhere in me. And if I feel that way, if I don't do the work and acknowledge that and work through that and be with it and understand it, then I will pass that on to my children as well.
And it is it's a lifelong practice to be able to
lifelong practice
to distance ourselves from that feeling of not enoughness, because everything in the world is designed to make us feel like we're not enough, right? Capitalism reinforces that.
Absolutely.
It's by the thing that will make us feel bad. Like everything sort of feeds into that. And I think so many of us can see that in our families. And it's such an interesting question around around generational legacies and like the strength that we inherit and also the complicated, struggles that get imprinted on us too. And I think about that a lot in our work around thinking about like, what are the legacies of Jewish women that we inherit? And it's complicated. We just did a workshop in Atlanta this past week with educators doing a project around stories and art. And it was interesting to talk to, and I was talking to some other people who had done this workshop and who were talking about how it was so much easier to work on their grandmother's story than on their mother's story, because there's just so much intensity there of that transmission, and somehow like it's hard to go there. And anyway, so I bring that up because I think there's, you do such a beautiful job in your book of teasing out some of those relationships, but also, and like talking about the ways that that parenting Mira and your other children, and thinking about your own role as a mother and what you learn from your kids and what you learn from your parents, and just putting that out there in a way that's very beautiful and also really real about how all of these things are very intertwined, and you can't, take one thread without pulling all the other threads as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I also love what you brought up, because I think it's both, right? In terms of inheriting these legacies, that we can inherit the ones that are painful or less comfortable, and we can also inherit the strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And so in doing the work, I mean, in terms of conscious parenting, even, it's doing the work, and then you get to choose, right? Is this just a belief that I took on that I have been following blindly? Or is this something I truly resonate with and I want to hold on?
Right.
But what we do is like in our sleep, and we just keep passing on these patterns without knowing. But I think, to me, that was one of the biggest lessons, and especially in raising Mira too, that I could love this person beyond anything I could have ever imagined, and love being her parent, and being exhausted as a caregiver, and not wanting to do that for the rest of my life.
Right.
And that's a tough thing it's a hard thing to hold at the same time.
Right. And that was one of the themes also in your book that I thought was so powerful, is that balance between caring for others and caring for yourself. Again, something that I think is hard for all people, and I think sometimes particularly hard for women. And I'm sure the urgency of that is even more so when you have a kid who needs a lot of help and can't be independent in certain ways. And, I think there's so much talk about self-care these days, and often it's in a kind of, sort of overly simplistic and commercialized way. Can you share some of your learning about this challenge, about how to strike that balance and how to grapple with it, and how to, constantly be resetting it?
Yes. So, and I agree with you 100% that I think as mothers, often the first thing to go when we're parenting our kids is ourselves, right? Some mothers are great at it, some others are not. But generally we lose our sense of selves. What lights us up? What did we enjoy doing that we then drop? And then when we're raising kids who have complex needs, it's really, it becomes or feels impossible, right? Because their needs are so great. And so when Mira was really young, I remember we lived in Cambridge, and I look for the cheapest rates when I could find them at the Charles Hotel. And I would book a room, and I would go for less than 24 hours to literally just escape and have, be able to eat breakfast when I want to, and just have no responsibilities, which wasn't quite as simple as that, because I still was worried about everything that was happening at home and what was or what wasn't happening. But I quickly learned that this was not sustainable, right? I couldn't just go to the Charles Hotel every time I was ready to, it was either go to an institution or the Charles Hotel. And I thought, well, actually the Charles Hotel would be a lot cheaper than the therapy or, some sort of institution. But I knew that wasn't sustainable. And so, while all of those things that we mostly understand about self-care, which often include time and money and going to the gym or getting pedicures and massage, that's all wonderful. But I realized, just as I realized when I was in the hotel, that it was very temporary. And as soon as I would walk back home, whatever sense of calm I felt was was out the window. And I thought, okay, well, I've got to figure out another way to maintain this. And yoga was a huge help for me, but it wasn't just the yoga on the mat. Like that helps. The way that I really see self-care now, I refer to as soul care, because it has so much more to do with the way that we love ourselves, the way that we care for ourselves, and not just, which of course includes our physical care, but it also is our emotional care, and it is our spiritual care, and it is the way that we talk to ourselves, right? It is in how literally almost every parent I work with feels like they're failing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's in shifting that, and how do we develop and build the muscle of self-compassion? Because going back to like what we take on from our parents, we bring these into our own parenting. And so there is this idea that when we get triggered, when we yell, when we're exhausted, or when we're being judgmental, that we can actually hold that part of ourselves with tenderness, with it's so understandable, because of usually going back to, I mean, being very simplistic here, but something that we did not get in our own childhood. And so we will take that and continue whatever messages we did get that fall in the realm of being judgmental towards ourselves or our own feelings of not enoughness. We then become our biggest perpetrators, and we carry that and continue to do that to ourselves. And then if we don't confront that and break that, we then continue to pass that on. So to me, self-care is now so much more about being kind to myself. It even means that if I'm doing something where I might feel some guilt about being away for a weekend and leaving my husband with the kids, it's about not trying to push that guilt away, but saying, okay, it is still okay for me to go and take some of that guilt with me, right? And it lessens over time. But I know that what I feel and how I treat myself, whether it's around parenting Mira or my other kids, or just myself in whatever I'm doing, you were using the word messy before. Part of it is like really loving and honoring my messy, and being okay with that, and learning to love myself as a whole person, messy and otherwise. Because Mira, I look at her challenges, and really, like, she's one of my greatest role models in this. She, as you said, radiates joy. She is not judgmental of herself. She doesn't have a cell phone. She's never had social media. She's my one experiment, with a child who has no access to social media. And I just think, wow, how amazing. She feels very free to express herself, every emotion, the upsets, the happy, the joy, the happy, the anger, the frustration. She's just who she is, unapologetically.
Right. And there's so much to learn from that. And you write about how, sometimes you're watching and worrying about how other people are going to interact with her and how they're going to judge her. And then you realize, like, you're creating your own story. It's not Mira's story. It's not necessarily the story of the other people. And, sort of how do you pull back and actually not overlay that story onto it, and just kind of recognize it for what it is, which is like your own imagination or fear or whatever.
Yeah. And then it's holding that with compassion. Like, it's so, again, it's like the three words, it's so understandable, are three of my favorites.
Yep. I know. I'm not the best around self-talk. And I often try to catch myself and think, like, I would never speak to a friend this way, the way that I speak to myself. And like, that's a really good, I catch myself when I think that, like, I would never use this tone with anyone other than myself, so it's like, okay, well, that's really messed up. And I have to notice that. And, it's a helpful wake up to just.
Yeah. And of course, that's all of us, right? I mean, that's every single one of us. And I think that is such a great example to use, because we can say, I would never speak to a friend like that. And I think also, I think there's, our kids give us so many opportunities to practice. I feel like some of the ways in which I've been able to bring some of that kindness or compassionate messaging to myself is through being able to hold that space for my kids. And in some ways it was easier to do with them than it was to do for me. But from that practice with them, I have been able to, ultimately bring it to myself. But right, if we're able to provide that for a friend, why the heck wouldn't we provide it to ourselves?
Right. Treat yourself like someone you love.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes easier said than done. I see we have a beautiful comment from Risa about her grandson who began his life in the NICU and being inspired by the strength that comes through and remembering that. And I think that brings us to another piece that is a really important theme in your book, which is all the things that you learn from Mira, and particularly learning to accept what you call the as is of life, and some of the things that are just that Mira is just better at, and has a lot to teach. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, the as is of life, and some of the ways that you've learned that from Mira?
Yeah, absolutely. It's also something that's such a huge yoga principle as well. When a dish falls off the counter and breaks on the floor, we have choices in how to respond, right? Especially if a kid did something and knocked it off, right? And often our reaction can be, what were you thinking? This is like this is my favorite dish, and whatever. What were you thinking? Why did you put that there? Et cetera, et cetera. Or we can say, okay, a dish broke, like it's done. It's happened. And when we accept, okay, it's done, it's happened, looking at that, all those inner voices that come up, just realizing that they're there, keeping them inside and saying, okay, it's happened. How do we want to move forward? So, that was sort of a simplistic example. I think with Mira, I remember so specifically when one of her physical therapists wanted her to get a wheelchair. And I was so obsessed with strollers that didn't look like wheelchairs. And I remember walking along the Charles River, and I remember seeing a woman pushing her son in a stroller. It was clearly a special needs stroller. And I ran her down and said, that's such a cool looking stroller. Like, where did you get that? And I wanted to have Mira in anything other than something that resembled a hospital looking piece of equipment. And at some point, I looked at her in one of these strollers and I thought, wow, this really isn't supporting her well. Her positioning is not ideal. This is not what she needs. And that, I think, is when I accepted, okay, she's going to use a wheelchair more than I thought. And once I accepted the as-isness of that, I was so resistant to looking at any wheelchair for her that once I accepted the as-is, then creativity comes forward. And it was like, okay, we can have fun picking out a wheelchair. We can have fun picking out the color. We can have fun picking out the gadgets or whatever. Do we put your name on it, et cetera? And it didn't necessarily disclude any continued working on trying to get her to walk. And I think that the challenge with the as-isness is that people often will think that it's sort of throwing your hands up and giving up. I couldn't have accepted the as-is of some of Mira's challenges without doing the fighting or the work that I did. But when we do get to that place of accepting the as-is, then it's like this fountain of creativity appears out of nowhere. I mean, it's like my son who plays hockey. I would have never imagined that I was going to be a hockey mom. And that was not in my vision. That was not in my expectation. It was not in my desires. It was not in my vision for who he was going to be. And he was at a birthday party when he was in first grade or second grade and got off the ice. It was at a skating rink and he got off the ice and he looked at me and he said, "Mom, I feel like I'm home." And I was like, okay, I accepted that. And he's been playing hockey ever since. But there's other ways in which we accept that as is. We can be bummed. We can be sad. Let's say we have big plans for something, a picnic outside and it rains. Well, we don't try to fight the rain. There's nothing we can do. We accept that it's raining and then we pivot. Right. So it's not about throwing the towel in. It's not about being passive. and just giving in, or seeing your kids doing something and not stepping in. But it is about accepting what is happening in that moment. So if you've got two kids that are fighting, the acceptance of the as is not, oh, it's okay to fight, and it's okay for you to treat each other that way. But it is accepting that right here in this moment, your kids are fighting. Like, accept that. And when you can accept that, then we can stand back for just a moment and figure out how we want to respond. We can step forward with, steps maybe 2 or 3, 5 seconds later, and enter with a state of presence, really. So that's a huge part of the as is.
And some of it sounds like is also about, it's back to that idea of like letting go of some of the control or some of the self-blame or whatever, and just sort of being like, this is not, I can't change this, and trying to change it is actually a distraction from whatever I need to be doing in this moment.
Correct. And I think, to give up the illusion that we have control in so many things, or with our kids in the first place, is what's so important.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in the act of trying to control, we end up with a result that is actually the exact opposite of what we're wanting in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, a deep practice.
A continual deep practice that is lifelong.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit? I mean, you talked before about, you were talking about sort of driving all over, pursuing every last therapy you could for Mira, and then wondering, like, is this even what she wants or needs? And you have a place in the book where you're talking about, actually not about Mira, but about some of the coaching and work that you do with other families, about this question about how you connect with someone who can't express what they're feeling. And that's true in so many ways. There's so many ways that you can be unable to express yourself, not just by being not verbal. But I'm curious how you try to figure that out with Mira. If she can't always, I mean, I'm sure there's many ways she can tell you things, but if she can't always tell you, how do you check in that way?
It's a great question. Sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes it's really, really hard. I think sometimes, there have been evenings where she goes to bed at night and it's so clear she has something to say, and there's no way for us to get there. And so we end up playing 21 questions. And she has an iPad that she uses for communication, but rudimentary. It's not, she can't, and she needs one of us to help her go through it. So we're giving her the choices of what to say. And it's like, it's almost like, imagining your kid wants to ask for some pasta dish for dinner. And the choices that you say, what you say are, oh, do you want to go outside or have an apple?
Right.
And they're like, no, I'm actually asking if I can have some pasta for dinner. And like, if that's not what we give her as an option to answer, she gets stuck. And one thing I've always been incredibly struck by with her is how she will, at some point, like, she accepts the as is. At some point, you can just tell she just kind of gives up, not in an angry way, but like, it's almost like she's saying, oh, you guys, you idiots, like, you don't get it.
You're so limited. Yeah.
You are so limited.
I'll try to work with your limitations.
Yeah. I'm going to go to bed and we'll start again tomorrow.
Right.
But so there's two sides to this. I feel like words, I'm looking at the books behind you. They're filled with words. Words are amazing. Words are incredibly powerful. And at the same time, words can be quite limiting. And there is something that I have gained from Mira being nonverbal, that it challenges me and pushes me to pay attention to her in a way that I don't have to when I'm conversing with someone who uses words. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, the word, of course, words can bring us to a place of emotion and feeling. But it's almost like with Mira, I have to we start there. And that's where we have to always be, because we don't have the words. And so she has helped me tune in and hone skills on listening in a much deeper way. And I think especially with kids, we often, even just the simplest questions at the end of a school day when we say, how was your day? And we really don't need to ask that to know how their day was, right? We can tell by the way they step into the car, the way they get off the bus, the way they place their backpacks down probably on the floor. When they throw their backpacks on the floor, we can tell from the way they move and from their facial expressions how they're feeling. And so I feel like sometimes words they can be silly. Mm-hmm. So I love and adore and treasure that with Mira. And it's painful at times when she is upset. And we even, will bring over her iPad and we'll go through the device. And it's just either we're going dead end to dead end, or we just can't access it. And it's a painful and horrible feeling to know that all she's trying to do is express something and we don't get it.
Right.
So it's been both.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Or just making decisions where she doesn't have a say, like planning for her future. She can't tell us.
Right.
And so, and at the same time, that just feels like we instead focus on this trust and connection that we have. So yeah, right. It's both.
Kind of redirect in certain ways, and it's, in some ways, I feel like it's like a more intense version of what can happen. I mean, words can always be in the way or insufficient. And this is a more extreme case of that.
Yeah.
Mira had a very special bat mitzvah, which you write about in the book and which I was privileged to witness. Tell us about it. What did it mean for your family, and what did it look like? I'm sure, it's still, there's a lot of work that needs to happen in the Jewish community, and probably most people have not been at a bat mitzvah like Mira's, and we have a lot to learn from that model.
Yeah, well, her bat mitzvah was an incredible day that I can't believe it was like 9 years ago. Leading up to it was, I don't even know where to begin. It was complex in so many ways. I mean, Mira was fortunate enough to attend for many years an amazing program here in the Boston area called Gateways, where she went from probably second grade and then did her bat mitzvah training there, where I think Gateways was really a model for me of not taking a kid and putting them in a cookie cutter ceremony or practice or ritual, but looking at the kid, understanding the kid, and then bringing the ritual to be meaningful. What would be meaningful for this person? And we were beyond fortunate to have the skills of Rebecca Redner, who, developed this program where basically for Miras Bat Mitzvah, she on her iPad had 2 buttons. Prayers were pre-recorded, and over her 2 years or 3 years in the B'nai Mitzvah class, she learned the blessings, learned the prayers, and the symbols to represent the blessings. And so with her hand, she could touch, literally there were, 2 buttons she would press to lead the prayers. And we had family and friends come from all over. And it was definitely a growing experience for me, because there was a part of myself that struggled both in sending my older son to Jewish day school, but not having Mira there, not having my younger son there, and our practice of Judaism not being terribly observant. I questioned whether Mira's bat mitzvah was going to be enough. And I can still completely tap into that feeling. I was not where I reside now, but I remember feeling like, is this going to be judged by others as not enough? And are people going to show up to this event? What if Mira doesn't participate? And the night before, where we had the photographer come to take photos at the synagogue, she was a mess. She cried. We got pictures. She's miserable in the pictures. And I just remember thinking, okay, what if this happens tomorrow? We've had all these people come in town. It's her bat mitzvah, feeling the pressure of this one day. And so I very much felt that and was nervous. At the same time, what I had been taught and what I truly believed was that the bat mitzvah was not about Mira's performance, but I wanted people to just enter her world and see how Mira's Judaism holds so much meaning for her, and talk about accepting that as is. I knew that whatever happened that day, I couldn't do anything about, right? It was going to roll out as it rolled out. And so fortunately, Mira rose to the occasion, and she was comfortable because she had her teacher next to her. She had the rabbi next to her, and she had her iPad, which she was familiar with. And she led the service. And she did not read from the Torah, because that is something that she is not able to do. And I think one of the most moving and most fascinating aspects to her bat mitzvah was having the people come, and especially like the teens who questioned, what is this going to be like? Like how, and I'm sure this was on the minds of many adults too. How does a child who's nonverbal become a bat mitzvah? Like, what is this going to look like? And I think people were very moved and surprised. And I will say what surprised me the most. So first of all, what I remember so specifically was singing Matovu as the service began, and Mira started squealing and dancing in her wheelchair, which just was such a lovely moment to like lighten the scene, and everybody was laughing, and she just pulled everybody in at that moment. And what I wasn't expecting, which was such a gift, was somebody coming up to me after Mira's service was over, who told me that they were struggling because one of their children was really resistant to becoming a bar mitzvah. And the child said to the mother afterwards, if I can have a bar mitzvah like this, I'm willing to do it. And I don't think it was, like, can I have a bar mitzvah like Mira's? But, oh my gosh, it doesn't have to look like all the bar mitzvahs that I've gone to. Like, it could actually be something that fits me, where I can be comfortable. So that was something I was never expecting in a million years, that Mira would actually, I knew she would touch the adults who came in to the room. And I knew that she would, if she participated, that she was going to feel the joy and radiate joy, and everybody would see what Mira's Judaism means to her, and bring them into the world of these symbolic pictures. But I didn't expect it to move or touch other kids. Mm-hmm. So that was mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the places where, it's like the message that like, oh, right, a bat mitzvah isn't about performance. It's about actually like what this all means to you, like, duh. And most of us forget that, I think, in the context of the kind of, B'nai Mitzvah industrial complex and right. And expectations and all of that. I mean, we had that, as you know, I have twins. My kids are extremely different from each other. My daughter read like the whole parsha. My son, she had been in day school. My son was not in day school, did not really read Hebrew, read like 2 verses. And there was a lot of question of like, how is he going to do this? Are people going to wonder why this is imbalanced or whatever? And is it okay that this is what he's doing? But what he did was actually play the drums, because that was how he could be involved in the service. And it was the only way to keep him from wandering around and leaving during the service. But he was really into it, and it was beautiful, and probably way more memorable than if he had read a longer piece of the Torah portion. And I think there are so many ways that like, we need to learn this lesson. Like, we all need to learn these lessons over and over. And I am sure it is not easy to be the kind of the case that where you have no choice but to innovate and do something that's totally out of the box, but it is such a, like, it's such a lesson that applies to everybody.
Yeah. Well, and you doing that with your son too is a beautiful example of accepting the as is, right? Like you could, I mean, we could also have said, never mind, you don't need to become a bar mitzvah. Like that's also fine, right? They fight it. It is totally okay and reasonable for us as parents to say, well, actually, I don't want you to miss out on this, but it doesn't have to look like this. And so you accepted the as isness of him not having that same type that your daughter did. And so it sounds like a beautiful way of honoring his essence, of honoring who he is. And we did the same with my son too. Like that bar mitzvah in a synagogue was not going to be his jam.
Do you think that the Jewish community is a particularly difficult place to raise a neurodivergent child, given just all the emphasis that's placed on learning and intellect and certain measures of success?
It's interesting to answer that living where we live, because I've been cradled by gateways. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was such a gift. Had we been, and I will say, I think synagogues now more than ever are so much more inclusive. So I haven't felt that as much with Mira, just because of where she's been and how she has been, how she has been honored and respected and treated. That said, I know, there's a synagogue that you and I both love very much, where I love going, but it was too hard for Mira let me back up. Partly it was too hard for Mira to go. Mostly it was too hard for us to go with Mira. Right. It was about, well, we could go on Saturday mornings, but that was our one morning where we didn't have to get her out of bed and get dressed and go. And if we do go, we didn't know if we would last 10 minutes or she'd be willing to be there the whole time, or we would need to feed her the whole time to keep her hushed, or we wouldn't keep her hushed, but then it would offend some people. And some people would be like, it's fine, it doesn't matter, but I know it would bother other people. And then there was a great babysitting program, but not somebody for Mira, because we couldn't leave her. So like that again is sort of, how much do I push? Right. And how much do I accept the as is?
Yeah. And
there's no clear answer. Do I wish that I will say, like the Jewish education, our family's Jewish participation is nothing like what I experienced as a kid or what I imagined. And do I have sadness about that? Yes. And at the same time, by stepping out of trying to control and making that happen, I think each of my three kids have found their own identity to Judaism in their own way. And it's not up to, I always bring it back to this. I could have controlled and pushed and fought so that they did what I wanted them to do, or it would look like what I wanted it to look like. But then I lose sight of them finding something on their own. And then this is how we set up this, you do it just because you do it, versus finding something that is meaningful for them. And so I think like my youngest is a great example of this, in that he went to 1 year of Jewish day school and then went to public school, and really also did not really receive any formal Jewish education except private tutoring for 2.5 years before his bar mitzvah. And he's now volunteering at Gateways. And to me, that's amazing, but it will fall where it falls for him. And it's where I intentionally choose connection. And I can still honor and love my Judaism. And I can, when it becomes easier for my husband and me, we can go back to the synagogue where we would love to be and love the community there. So it's accepting that right now it's not working for us and it would cause too much tension. At another time, we will go back and it will be meaningful. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is what will bring me back to maybe even part of the self-care conversation too, is that if I embody what is so important to me, that I trust that my kids will take in what they take in, and then they will find what is meaningful for them, which I find much more important than if they do it just because I told them to. And so it's, again, prioritizing this connection. So this self-care piece is, if we free ourselves to live a life that is meaningful for us, then it sets our children free to live a life that is meaningful for them.
Right. And I think also it's like part of the as is piece is recognizing that you're accepting what is in this moment, but like it's the next moment is going to be different. And we can't judge by what this moment is. We just have to be in it. And then also recognize like it's going to change whether we like it or not. This moment could be great, but like, too bad, can't hold on to it. It's going to change.
Yeah. And we as adults are not so great about living in the present moment in that way. It takes us work. Our kids are living in it all the time.
Right. Right.
It's really easy for us to jump to the future or leap or jump back into the past.
Yeah. We're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you about how, you do so much different kinds of work on parenting and coaching. And I'm curious how you decided it was time to write a book. And I'm also curious whether you included Mira at all in the process of writing the book.
I did not ever intend to write a book. And the reason that I wrote the book was from a telephone conversation I had with my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Shafali Tsabari. And we were catching up on the phone. We were friends from graduate school. And I was catching her up and telling her about my kids and Mira. And she said, well, are you writing a book? And I said, no, I'm not a writer. And I could never write a book. And she said, you need to write a book. And I said, why? And she said, you need to write a book because if you don't write a book, you are denying so many people the experience of learning from what you have learned. And I was like, okay, that I can get behind. Like the idea of writing a book and being a writer and having a book it was not my comfort zone. I just felt like, no. But sharing my story, to share it with others, was something I could really get behind. And so that's when I decided I would write the book. And in deciding to do that, I also knew that I could not hold myself accountable, and it was okay to ask for help, which was also not one of my strengths. So raising Mira, I had to learn how to ask for help. And in writing my book, I had to learn how to ask for help. So I hired a coach, and together over many years, I finally wrote the book. Did I involve Mira in the process? She's so involved in the process in her involvement in the book, but I would say probably not so much in my writing of the book. But she loves seeing her face on the cover, and she loves stamping her name when she signs books. So I think she thinks it's pretty cool. But in terms of my involvement in the process with her, not so much. But without her, the book would not have been written.
For sure. And she shines through. And so much of it is really about wisdom that she helped bring to light. And I think that comes through very clearly. And I'm so glad you wrote the book. It's really beautiful. It's really important for people to hear your story and your path. And, at JWA, we're all about stories, and what is powerful about sharing your story and about knowing, all the things that we learn from knowing that we're not alone. And from seeing the ways that other people are navigating and learning and making connections. And it's such an example. You talk so much in the book, and you mentioned it tonight too, about that soul to soul connection. And I think that sharing stories is one of the ways that happens also. It really shines through. So thank you so much for sharing your story in the book, for sharing your story with us tonight. Thanks to all of you who are in the room with us and part of this community. As always, there is more to explore at JWA that is relevant. We have a few links to share, and there's always so much on the site. It's hard for me to know what to pull out that's relevant for a particular conversation. But a couple of things I thought I would highlight. we have a nice piece from a mom and educator, Rachel Kest, about parenting and education of her 2 neurodivergent kids. We have a lot of material on disability rights activists. You can read about Marilyn Goldman or listen to our podcast with Judy Heumann, who actually just passed away a few weeks ago. You can learn about Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, who is the first blind woman to become a rabbi. One of my favorite new encyclopedia entries is about the choreographer Victoria Marks, who founded the Dancing Disability Lab at UCLA. You can read our interview with Riva Lehrer, who's an artist with spina bifida and talks a lot about what it means to be disabled and make art. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Lulua Khazzoum on her anthology, The Flying Camel, Essays on Identity by Women of North African and Middle Eastern Jewish Heritage. It's going to be great to speak with her. And until next time, be well and thank you. And thank you again, Cindy, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Judith. And thank you to everybody who was here.
Wonderful. Good night, everyone.